So it's quite intimidating coming to speak to a scientific audience as a lawyer, but I'm also very honored to be included and part of this important conversation on load shedding and energy in South Africa. And the angle that I come at this issue is that there's a direct relationship between South Africa's dependence on coal and indeed load shedding, given the shortfall on the South African power grid currently. And importantly, a shift away from energy produced by coal could not only help to address the energy shortfall, it's also a necessity in a time of climate crisis. And I view climate change as a crisis issue, along with the broader scientific community currently, as well as a justice issue, because if governments fail to respond to climate change, the poorest 40% of the world's population, which is around 2.6 billion people, will be consigned to a future involving diminished opportunity as deep inequalities within countries are exacerbated. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their 21 synthesis report, has warned of the importance of quickly transitioning to a zero carbon economy within states in order to limit average surface temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, recognizing the catastrophic implications of failing to do so. And achieving this goal means moving away from energy generated by fossil fuels, as you'll all be aware, including coal, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions responsible for climate change. And transitioning to a low carbon economy will further limit the harm created by the impacts of climate change, particularly in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa that are least able to adapt to climate change impacts and which have a high proportion of vulnerable people. However, it must be acknowledged that the transition could cause grave injustice as well. People could be left behind. And a significant risk of a fast transition is that the burdens of the transition will fall on the vulnerable and disadvantaged, producing barriers to achieving energy equality and development goals. This presentation is going to outline some of the ways in which South African policy is responding to the challenge of a just energy transition in a time of climate crisis. And the space in which policy is being developed and this presentation is being given is really evolving and very exciting. It's a space where every time you do research, a new document has been drafted and new law is on the way. And so that's exciting and positive from South Africa's perspective. The discussion is also particularly timely, given that in a few days, from 31 October to 12 November, the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties is set to take place in Glasgow to accelerate climate action towards the goal of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, of course, being the international legal instrument to which South Africa is a party, along with 194 other countries, and in terms of which states have committed to taking measures to prevent catastrophic climate change. So let's just very briefly, and you are all far more equipped to comment on this issue than me, but very briefly elaborate on the links between climate change and coal-fired power. So according to the Global Carbon Atlas, referring to 2019 data, South Africa is the 12th highest greenhouse gas emitter in the world and the highest emitter in Africa. The World Bank rates South Africa as the 13th highest emitter. Either way, this isn't great. We don't want to be ranking so high in this kind of ranking. And it's not controversial that coal-fired power contributes significantly towards our greenhouse gas emissions in South Africa, a fact that is recognized in multiple government reports. So among others, South Africa's greenhouse gas inventory report for 2000 to 2010, and this is confirmed in subsequent reports, indicates that electricity generation is the largest key greenhouse gas emission source in South Africa, primarily because it uses sub-bituminous coal, which is abundantly available in the country. And in addition, our courts have recognized that coal-fired power is a climate change issue. In 2017, there was a seminal decision by the Western Cape, or at least the Gauteng High Court, that confirmed that a coal-fired power development should not go ahead and would be unlawful and a violation of our environmental rights in our constitution if climate change impacts had not been fully assessed. And the government hadn't fully assessed those impacts, and therefore the coal-fired power station was declared, or the approval of the coal-fired power station rather, was declared invalid, and the government had to reconsider whether or not to approve it based on climate change impacts. And so this is an ongoing issue that the government is acutely aware of and is grappling with all the time. However, it has to be said that there's a huge tension between different ministries within the government. On the one hand, the Environmental Affairs Ministry is grappling with this topic from the perspective that there's a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and shift towards renewable energy, whereas the Department of Minerals and Energy is very much still vested in coal as a means to produce energy in the country. And there's ongoing debates, which are very public. This is not me sharing anything that I'm sure you haven't read in recent newspaper reports. But importantly, coal-fired power in South Africa is not only responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions contributing to climate change, but also severe respiratory illnesses to which children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable, and reportedly thousands of deaths each year, largely in Mpumalanga, resulting in what's known as the deadly air litigation, where civil society organizations are demanding that the Minister of Environmental Affairs take urgent action to address air pollution in the Highveld to respond to devastating health impacts from coal-fired power. These harmful impacts of coal-fired power represent climate and environmental injustices. They are distributed unevenly in South Africa, such that they are disproportionately experienced by vulnerable and disadvantaged persons who are least responsible for the harms and at the same time enjoy minimal access to energy security and other benefits of the environment. Further, these impacts undermine the attainment of the Constitution's social justice imperative, our supreme law, which demands that we develop a society founded on social justice, and undermines the fulfillment of all human rights, since a well-functioning environment creates the conditions in which social justice can be achieved and human rights can be fulfilled. So the good news is that the concept of a just transition as a means to move away from fossil fuel-driven energy is gaining traction in South African policy. But what does a just energy transition mean? How we conceptualize it matters. So initially, the concept of a just transition emerged out of a concern for workers impacted by decarbonization policies that have the potential to leave fossil fuel and other related workers and their communities without employment and in decline, certainly a laudable goal and one that should be addressed in a transition. However, a just transition in this narrow conceptualization where workers are the only focus can have the result of pitting the environment and concern for the environment against employment. And that's a false binary that just energy transition policies need not pursue. They should certainly be, in my view at least, and this can be debated, a broader or expanded conceptualization of justice within the energy transition that considers not only lost employment opportunities, but also existing energy inequality and poverty. So more broadly, as well as environmental and climate justice, responding then to energy poverty ought to be not just about energy justice in terms of promoting any kind of energy, but clean energy, not energy that locks nations in to fossil fuels for the foreseeable future and ignores environmental and climate justice. Environmental and climate justice are pursued in a substantive sense when the distribution of benefits and burdens occurs equitably and past injustices are addressed, all the while recognizing the equal moral worth and dignity of human beings. And so these ideas need to be embraced within a just energy transition if we're going to do it right, if we're going to respond to the constitutional social justice imperative, and we're going to address the needs of workers. So it doesn't help to solve one problem, but cause another that equally contributes to climate change and causes a raft of other injustices. In addition, restorative justice should be part of the picture. And restorative justice is about addressing the harm or risk of harm that has been occasioned as a result of long-term unjust practices. So in the context of Mpumalanga, it would entail not just stopping air pollution, but also restoring water sources that have been polluted by acid mine drainage as a result of coal mining over a long period of time. So what does then the policy framework look like? And I apologize for such a lawyerly presentation. I hope it's not too out of reach or too technical. I'm going to speak mainly about South Africa's nationally determined contribution, which is its commitment to achieving the Paris Agreement, its contribution to the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. There's a few other policies that sort of square up with the current NDC. And those are the National Development Plan of 2030 and the Integrated Resource Plan. And there's so much more that I could speak about, but won't for time purposes. What's important about the nationally determined contribution is it is what's being tabled at the Conference of the Parties next week by South Africa as our commitment to climate change. So it's like the most current, up-to-date, official statement of South African policy towards our move away from coal. And that's why it's the focus now. So let's think about where we've come from. Our first nationally determined contribution, which took effect in 2016, when we initially ratified the Paris Agreement, proposed a peak, plateau, decline, GHG emissions trajectory range, where we would see emissions peak between 2020 and 2025, plateau for about a decade, and then decline in absolute terms thereafter. The NDC also envisaged investment in the energy sector to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, including through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. And I think we've spoken a bit about that in the conference already, and that policy approach has started to bear some fruit. The first NDC estimated that to decarbonize electricity in South Africa by 2050, we would need around 349 billion US dollars. And so huge investments needed, and investments are still needed and are a big part of South Africa's engagement at the COP26 next week, where we're expected to benefit from the Paris Agreement's provisions for financing towards renewables. South Africa's climate commitment was rated highly insufficient by the Climate Action Tracker. And this is unsurprising. It was highly insufficient, means that we're not going to achieve the global temperature goal using this kind of metric that South Africa initially proposed. It just wasn't ambitious enough. Not enough steps to transition away from dirty energy were proposed, and we weren't, as I said, sufficiently ambitious. So then in March 2021, we had our proposed update to our NDC, reflecting on its own terms the country's highest level of ambition based on science and equity in light of our national circumstances. And within the NDC, the idea of a just transition, broadly conceptualized, is at the core. However, on the negative side, and worryingly from an environmental and climate justice perspective, although this can be debated from a science perspective, shale gas extraction and energy production are proposed as an alternative to coal. The updated NDC states that long-term decarbonization of South Africa's economy will focus on the electricity sector. So that's positive, with a deeper transition in other sectors going forward. There's still a peak, plateau, and decline trajectory, but the mitigation targets and the carbon budgets are much more ambitious. Again, you would know much more about that than me. The NDC's mitigation target is expressed in greenhouse gas emission terms rather than policy goals. So there isn't a lot of detail about how substantive justice will be advanced, but the concept of a just transition is positioned as the core of the document. There's a proposal for massive investment in renewable energy, their words, massive, and recognition that this will yield co-benefits such as reduced air pollution in already polluted areas, reduced water consumption in water-scarce areas, among others. The NDC states that measures that plan for workforce reskilling, job absorption, social protection, and livelihood creation, as well as incentivizing new green sectors, will have to be put in place. The cost of restoration needed to restore damaged ecosystems and areas affected by coal isn't really addressed. And this is obviously a problem given the specter of deadly air that we are grappling with at the moment. So the NDC now represents much greater ambition than the first NDC, but it's still widely criticized. It's much closer to being sufficient than the previous NDC, but the climate action tracker is not satisfied with it and feels we need to do more. Perhaps where some of the detail will come about is in the just transition plan envisaged by the NDC. So the just transition plan is currently, I think, in progress and is an evolving plan. And it's being drafted or put together by the Presidential Climate Committee, but this committee is putting together a just transition framework. I think those are the same thing. The commission chaired by the President and includes commissioners from the Minister of Energy and Minerals and Energy to the Minister of Environmental Affairs, as well as a range of civil society stakeholders, such as directors of leading environmental organizations, including EarthLife Africa Johannesburg and Groundwork, is developing the framework as a practical guide for all affected stakeholders in South Africa's energy transition to a low emissions economy, not a zero carbon economy. And definitely, I think we can take heart in this development, because from what we've seen so far, there's a wonderful, transparent, up-to-date website of all the Commission's activities, and the reports available on that website so far reveal very much a broad conceptualization of a just energy transition, speak in quite a lot of detail to the need for restoration, and recognize that leaving no one behind means addressing social justice, and means addressing workforce issues along with livelihoods, along with pollution issues, along with climate justices. So it's definitely a positive step in the right direction that we are developing this plan. The question is how quickly and whether it will inform concrete changes on the ground. And that remains to be seen. But to conclude, the energy landscape in South Africa must transition. And this isn't just because of load shedding, although of course load shedding is a massive problem in multiple respects, but also because in a time of climate change, fossil fuel driven energy is a justice issue, particularly for vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Thank you for your time and attention.